The massive warship Aegis shook violently as enemy fire tore through its shields. On the command bridge, Admiral Kim Soo gripped her chair and watched the worst defeat in human history unfold before her eyes. The holographic display showed 17 colonies going dark, one after another. Each red dot represented millions of human lives being snuffed out. "Admiral, we just lost New Seoul Colony," Lieutenant Park Jin called out, his voice cracking with stress. "That's the 5th one. In 2 hours. The Kepler defense grid is almost gone. Only 30% of our stations are still responding." Kim Soo closed her eyes for a moment. In her 40 years of military service, she had never seen anything like this. The Veltar war machines were beyond anything humanity had ever faced. These alien invaders had been conquering worlds for 10,000 years, crushing civilizations that were far more advanced than Earth. Their ships could bend space and time. Their weapons could tear holes in reality itself. To the Veltar, humans were nothing special. Just another weak species that would fall within days. Humans had no special powers, no ability to read minds or move objects with thought. They couldn't manipulate energy or bend the laws of physics. All they had were basic plasma weapons and stubborn courage, which meant nothing against an enemy that could warp reality. "Ma'am, incoming transmission from the Harmony," Park Jin reported. "Captain Lee Min is requesting immediate evacuation support for the civilian transports." Kim Soo watched as another human fleet got torn apart on the display. The Harmony was trying to protect refugee ships filled with families fleeing the outer colonies. But the Veltar dreadnoughts were closing in fast, their dark hulls bristling with weapons that could vaporize entire cities. "Tell Captain Lee Min to fall back to the inner system," she ordered. "We can't save those transports if we lose our remaining ships." The bridge fell silent except for the constant alerts and damage reports. Everyone knew they were losing badly. The Veltar had destroyed human fleets that should have been impossible to defeat. Their technology was so advanced, it seemed like magic. Kim Soo made a decision that would change everything. She turned to her communications officer with grim determination. "Open a secure channel to Earth," she commanded. "Authorization code Omega 77. Park Jin looked confused. "Admiral, that's a code I've never heard before." "Because it's been classified above your clearance level," Kim Soo replied. "Send activation authorization for Project Lazarus to Dr. Lee Han at Seoul National University." The young lieutenant's face went pale. "Admiral, I've heard rumors about that project. Wasn't it classified as extremely dangerous?" Kim Soo nodded grimly. "Theoretical suicide was the exact term used by the Science Council. But look around us, Lieutenant. Conventional warfare isn't working. We're facing actual suicide right now. At least this gives us a chance. Far below on Earth's surface, deep, in the underground laboratories beneath Seoul National University, Dr. Lee Han was working late when the message arrived. His hands shook as he read the authorization codes. For 3 years, he and his small team had been studying something that defied all scientific explanation. "Dr. Choi Min, get over here," he called to his research partner. "We just received activation authorization for the Awakening Protocol." Dr. Choi Min hurried over, her face filled with concern. "Are you serious? The project we've been working on was just theoretical research. We don't even understand how these artifacts work." The artifacts they had discovered were unlike anything in human history. Ancient stones and metal fragments found buried at the world's oldest sacred sites. Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid, Angkor Wat, Machu Picchu. All of these places contained identical materials that somehow predated known human civilization by thousands of years. The strangest part was how these artifacts responded to human DNA. When touched by human hands, they would warm up and emit a faint energy signature. Brain scans of people who handled them showed unusual activity in regions associated with ancestral memory and collective unconscious experiences. "The resonance patterns suggest these artifacts are connected somehow," Dr. Lee Han explained to his nervous assistant. "They're positioned along what ancient cultures called ley lines, energy pathways that circle the entire planet." Dr. Choi Min checked her instruments one more time. "The quantum resonance readings are off the charts. If we activate this network, we have no idea what might happen to the human population." The alternative is extinction, Dr. Li Han replied, looking at the battle reports streaming in from space. Our entire species is about to be wiped out. Whatever these artifacts were meant to do, now is the time to find out. He placed his hand on the activation console, feeling the strange warmth that always accompanied contact with the mysterious materials. Begin the awakening sequence. May our ancestors forgive us for what we're about to unleash. The first pulse of energy originated from Stonehenge, traveling along invisible pathways that connected sacred sites across the globe. The pyramids began to hum with power, then Angkor Wat, then Machu Picchu. Ancient stones that had stood silent for millennia suddenly blazed within a light. As the network activated, something that had been sleeping in the depths of human consciousness began to wake up. Every person on Earth felt it, a strange stirring in the back of their minds, like half-remembered dreams of heroes and gods, of battles fought with weapons forged from starlight and willpower itself. In space above, the battle continued to rage. But deep in the collective unconscious of humanity, something ancient and powerful was stirring to life. The strange dreams started hitting humans everywhere at the same time. People who had never experienced anything unusual in their lives suddenly found themselves jolting awake in cold sweats, their minds flooded with impossible memories. On the remote mining station Kepler-7, engineer Yun Tae woke up screaming at 3 in the morning. His roommates found him sitting on his bunk, shaking and muttering about battles in the stars. But these weren't battles from human history. They were something else entirely, filled with warriors who fought with weapons made of pure light and willpower. I saw myself holding a sword made of lightning, Yun Tae told his concerned friends. And I knew exactly how to use it, like I'd been training my whole life. For that's impossible. I'm just a mining engineer. When his shift started that morning, something incredible happened. Yun Tae picked up his standard-issue plasma cutter, the same tool he'd used for 5 years to slice through asteroid rock. But the moment his fingers wrapped around the handle, strange symbols appeared along its surface, ancient runic markings that seemed to burn with inner fire. His supervisor walked over to check on him. Yun Tae, what did you do to your equipment? I've never seen modifications like that before. I didn't modify anything, Yun Tae replied, staring at the glowing symbols. They just appeared when I touched it. To test the tool, he aimed it at a piece of scrap metal they'd been trying to cut for weeks, a fragment of Veltar armor plating that their best equipment couldn't even scratch. The plasma cutter sliced through it like butter, leaving edges so clean they looked polished. Word of the incident spread quickly through the station. Other workers began reporting similar experiences. Tools that had worked normally for years were suddenly displaying impossible capabilities. Equipment operators found themselves understanding complex machinery they'd never been trained on. Security guards discovered they could sense threats from distances that should have been impossible. Back on Earth, Dr. Kang Hai was monitoring the situation from her laboratory in Seoul. She had worked with Dr. Li Han on the artifact project, and now she was watching readings that made no scientific sense. The energy signatures coming from the sacred sites are beyond anything our instruments can measure, she reported to the Emergency Council. Stonehenge is putting out more power than a fusion reactor, but it's not any kind of energy we understand. And it's not just Earth. We're getting similar readings from human colonies across the galaxy. The patterns were spreading through human space like ripples in a pond. Every person of human descent, no matter how far from Earth, was experiencing the same phenomenon. Scientists called it quantum entanglement on a species-wide scale, but even they didn't really understand what was happening. Meanwhile, in the command ship of the Veltar invasion fleet, High Commander Zarketh was reviewing battle reports with growing irritation. His species had conquered over 1,000 worlds in the past 10,000 years. They had seen dying civilizations try desperate last-resort weapons before. This was nothing new. "Sir, we're detecting massive energy spikes from the human homeworld," his science officer reported. "The primitive sites they call temples and monuments are showing unprecedented activity." Zarketh barely looked up from his tactical display. "Their planet is dying. These are probably just the final power surges from their collapsing infrastructure. Focus on eliminating their remaining military assets. But down on the front lines, Veltar ground troops were reporting encounters that didn't match anything in their extensive combat databases. Human soldiers who had been retreating for weeks were suddenly fighting with skills and weapons that seemed to defy the laws of physics. On Colony 7, Captain Song Min was leading what everyone assumed would be humanity's final stand. Her unit had been pushed back to the main settlement, surrounded by Veltar shock troops that had never lost a battle. These alien warriors were 8 feet tall, covered in armor that could deflect any human weapon, and armed with energy weapons that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level. Song Min crouched behind the remains of a destroyed transport. Watching her soldiers prepare for what they all knew would be their last fight, they were outnumbered 20-1, cut off from any hope of rescue, with ammunition running low. "Captain, they're moving in for the final assault," Sergeant Park Zhao reported over the comm. "Estimated 3 minutes before they overrun our position." Song Min checked her rifle one more time and prepared to give the order to advance. They would die fighting, but at least they would die as humans. But as she stood up to address her, "Troops," something extraordinary happened. A warmth spread through her chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual details on Veltar armor from hundreds of meters away. Her muscles felt stronger than they ever had, filled with energy that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her genetic memory. "Listen, zap everyone," she called out to her soldiers, and her voice carried farther than should have been possible. "We're not dying here today, we're going home." As the Veltar forces charged their position, Song Min raised her rifle and felt electricity dancing between her fingers. The weapon in her hands began to glow with the same runic symbols that were appearing on human equipment across the galaxy. "Humanity!" she roared, and her battle cry echoed across dimensions that her species had never been able to perceive before. Lightning erupted from her position, striking the advancing aliens with the fury of an ancient storm. The other human soldiers felt the same power awakening in their blood, their standard weapons transforming into something that belonged in the legends of gods and heroes. The impossible had begun to happen. Humanity was fighting back with power that came from the deepest parts of their collective soul. The changes happening to humans were speeding up faster than anyone could have imagined. What had started as strange dreams and glowing tools was becoming something that rewrote the rules of what was possible. Marine Corporal O.J. was fighting on the front lines of Kepler Station when he discovered what he could really do. His unit was pinned down by Veltar heavy weapons, the kind that could punch through 3 feet of reinforced steel. His fellow Marines were taking cover behind whatever they could find, but it wasn't enough. "We need to fall back," his sergeant shouted. Over the sound of enemy fire, "We can't hold this position." But O.J. felt something building up inside his chest, like pressure before a thunderstorm. He stood up from behind his cover, completely exposed to enemy fire, and opened his mouth to shout a warning to his team. What came out wasn't just his voice. It was thunder itself, rolling across the battlefield with the power of a natural disaster. The sound waves hit the Veltar positions like a physical force, shorting out their advanced electronics and sending their soldiers flying backward. "Did I just do that?" O.J. asked, staring at his own hands in amazement. His rifle had changed too. Instead of the standard human plasma weapon, he was now holding something that looked like it belonged in ancient mythology. Lightning danced along the barrel, and when he pulled the trigger, bolts of electricity arced out to strike his enemies with perfect accuracy. Halfway across the galaxy, physicist Dr. Nam He was facing a different kind of problem. She was trying to evacuate civilian refugees from the Centauri colonies, but Veltar patrol ships had blocked all the escape routes. Thousands of families were trapped with nowhere to run. "There has to be a way," she muttered, studying the star charts in her laboratory aboard the refugee transport. "Some kind of solution the computers aren't seeing." As she concentrated on the problem, she began to see space differently. The empty vacuum between stars wasn't really empty. It was full of folds and curves that could be bent and shaped. She reached out with her mind, and reality responded to her touch like clay in the hands of a sculptor. "Captain, you need to see this," her assistant called out, pointing at the sensors. Where there had been empty space a moment before, there was now a pocket of twisted space-time that their instruments couldn't properly detect. Dr. Nam Hee Hadiki created a hiding place that existed between dimensions, large enough to conceal their entire convoy of refugee ships. "How did you do that?" the ship's captain asked, staring at the readings in disbelief. "I honestly don't know," Dr. Nam Hee replied. "I just thought about what I needed and somehow it happened. Similar reports were coming in from every corner of human space. A mechanic on Mars discovered he could repair damaged equipment just by touching it, his hands somehow knowing exactly what was wrong and how to fix it. A farmer's daughter on New Terra found she could make crops grow faster by singing to them, her voice carrying power that made plants reach toward the sound. The Veltar Empire had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years by mastering psychic warfare. They could read minds, bend reality, and manipulate energy in ways that made other species helpless before them. But now they were facing something completely different. "Status report," High Commander Zarketh demanded as he stormed into his war room. "How are we losing battles against these primitive humans?" His intelligence officer, a tall alien with insect-like features, clicked his mandibles nervously before responding. "Sir, the humans are displaying abilities that don't match any known psychic evolution patterns. Our reality-warping weapons can have no effect on them. It's as if they're operating under completely different rules." "That's impossible," Zarketh snarled. "We've studied their species for decades. They have no special abilities, no energy manipulation, no psychic potential whatsoever." "Our xenobiologists have a theory, sir," the officer continued carefully. "They believe the humans weren't actually primitive. They were dormant. Something has awakened capabilities that were always there, hidden in their genetic structure." Reports kept coming in, each one more impossible than the last. Human soldiers who could walk through solid walls, pilots who could navigate hyperspace without computers, engineers who could build weapons by reshaping matter with their bare hands. But the most disturbing news came from the enslaved species across the Veltar Empire. For thousands of years, these conquered peoples had accepted their fate, believing that resistance was hopeless. Now they were watching humans, supposedly the weakest species in the galaxy, pushing back against their unstoppable conquerors. The crystal-singing Kithara began to remember songs their ancestors had sung before the conquest. The dragon-like Drakmari felt old instincts stirring, memories of when their warriors had ridden solar winds between the stars. Even species that had been slaves for so long they'd forgotten their own names started to whisper about freedom. "Sir, we are receiving reports of uprisings in 17 different systems," the intelligence officer reported, his voice shaking. "The slave species are rebelling. They're saying that if humans can fight back, so can they." High Commander Zarketh felt something he hadn't experienced in centuries of conquest: fear. His empire had been built on the idea that the Veltar were naturally superior to other species, that their psychic abilities made them destined to rule. But these humans were proving that power could come from sources his people had never imagined. "Double the security on all slave worlds," he ordered, "and bring our best scientists to study these human abilities. We need to understand what we're dealing with." But in his private moments, away from his subordinates, Zarketh began to suspect the truth. Humanity's apparent weakness hadn't been a flaw, it had been a chrysalis. While other species had developed their abilities early and plateaued, humans had been storing their potential, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Something far older and more powerful than the Veltar Empire had been sleeping in human DNA, and now it was finally awake. The galaxy's newest species was about to show everyone what they were truly capable of when pushed to the edge of extinction. The age of easy conquest was coming to an end. Now that humans had discovered their true power, it was time to go on the attack. Admiral Kim Soo stood in the command center of the rebuilt human fleet, looking at a galaxy-wide tactical display. For the first time in months, the red markers showing Veltar positions were actually retreating. "Begin Operation Ragnarok," she announced to her officers. "Every human ship, every colony, every outpost, we hit them all at once, everywhere, with everything we've got." The coordinated attack was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human forces that had been hiding and running for months suddenly burst from their positions with power that defied explanation. Captain Lim Da led the 7th Fighter Squadron through hyperspace toward the Veltar stronghold at Beta Centauri. But something had changed about the way humans traveled between stars. Instead of relying on computers and navigation systems, the pilots found they could sense the currents of space itself. "Follow my lead," Lim Da called to her squadron over the comm. "Trust your instincts, not your instruments." Her fighter moved through hyperspace like it was dancing, weaving between dimensions that normal ships couldn't even detect. Behind her, the other pilots followed in perfect formation, their ships leaving trails of brilliant light that looked like the northern aurora back on Earth. These energy trails did more than just look beautiful. They were disrupting Veltar communications across entire star systems. The alien command networks that had coordinated their empire for thousands of years were suddenly going silent as human ships passed through hyperspace nearby. "This is impossible," muttered Veltar Fleet Commander Kethvar as his communication systems failed one by one. "How are they jamming our quantum networks? They don't even understand the technology." Meanwhile, on the ground, human soldiers were discovering they could fight in ways that belonged more to legend than modern warfare. Sergeant Bayek Ho was leading his squad through the ruins of New Kyoto Colony, trying to reclaim it from Veltar occupation forces that had been dug in for weeks. The enemy had built fortifications that should have been impossible to breach. Energy, shields that could stop any known weapon, automated defense systems that never missed their targets, and trenches protected by force fields that bent space itself. But as Baek Ho approached the first enemy position, he felt a familiar warmth spreading through his body. His standard-issue rifle began to glow with inner fire, and his vision became sharp enough to see weak points in the alien defenses that shouldn't have been visible. "Charge!" he roared, and his voice carried the fury of ancient warriors who had fought with nothing but courage and steel. His squad followed him over the top, their weapons blazing with light that cut through Veltar force fields like they were made of paper. The aliens inside their impregnable fortifications found themselves facing humans who fought with a savage joy that their tactical computers couldn't analyze or predict. But the real change was happening on a much larger scale. Across the galaxy, the slave species that had served the Veltar Empire for millennia were watching humans achieve the impossible. If these primitive newcomers could fight back against their masters, maybe freedom wasn't just a dream. The crystal-singing Kithara were the first to rebel. On the mining world of Kepler 9, they began to sing the old songs their grandparents had taught them, melodies that made their crystal tools resonate with power their overseers had never seen before. The dragon-like Drakmari followed next, remembering how their ancestors had once soared between stars without need for ships. On agricultural worlds throughout Veltar space, Drakmari workers suddenly spread wings that hadn't been used in centuries and took to the skies. What made it even worse for the Veltar is that humans seemed to be broadcasting something through the psychic networks the aliens used to control their slaves. Where Veltar mind control had once forced obedience and despair, human thoughts were now carrying messages of hope and freedom. Private Lee Ho was fighting his way through a Veltar command bunker when he felt his mind touch something vast, the collective consciousness of every enslaved being in the galaxy. Without understanding how, he began projecting images of Earth, of humans standing free under open skies, of a galaxy where every species could choose its own destiny. "What's happening to our control networks?" demanded Veltar Overseer Nalthek, as his slave populations began to revolt simultaneously across dozens of worlds. "The humans are somehow using our own psychic systems against us." The rebellion spread like wildfire. Species that had forgotten their own names were remembering their original cultures. Worlds that had been strip-mined for thousands of years were suddenly defended by their inhabitants with desperate courage. High Commander Zarketh watched his empire crumbling from his flagship above the Veltar homeworld. For 10,000 years, his people had believed they were destined to rule because of their natural superiority. Now he was discovering that their greatest strength, their psychic network, had become their greatest weakness. "Recall all forces. To the core systems," he ordered, his voice shaking with barely controlled panic. abandon the outer territories and concentrate our power around the homeworld. But even as he gave the order, Zarketh knew it might already be too late. These humans weren't just fighting with advanced weapons or superior tactics. They were fighting with something his species had never encountered, the combined dreams and stories of an entire civilization that refused to give up. Every human soldier carried within them the echoes of every hero from their planet's history. Every pilot flew with the skill of legendary warriors. Every engineer built with the knowledge of mythical craftsmen who had forged weapons for gods. "Sir," his intelligence officer reported quietly, "our xenobiologists have completed their analysis of the human transformation. They believe we're not fighting against a single species anymore. We're fighting against the collective unconscious of their entire evolutionary history." Zarketh stared out at the stars and realized that his empire, which had seemed eternal, just months ago was facing something it had never prepared for, an enemy that grew stronger every time they were pushed closer to extinction. The tide of war had turned, and humanity was just getting started. The final battle for the galaxy's freedom was about to begin above Veltar Prime, the ancient homeworld of the Empire that had ruled for 10,000 years. Admiral Kim Soo stood on the bridge of her flagship, looking out at the most incredible sight in galactic history. Surrounding her human fleet were ships from dozens of species that had broken free from Veltar control. The crystal-singing Kythera had crafted vessels that hummed with harmonic energy. The dragon-like Drakmari flew alongside in formations that moved like living creatures through space. Even species that had been enslaved so long they'd forgotten their original names had somehow built ships that reflected their ancient cultures. "All units, this is Admiral Kim Soo," she broadcast across the massive Allied fleet. "Today we don't just fight for our own freedom. We fight for the freedom of every being who has ever dared to dream of something better." The response came back, in dozens of languages, but the meaning was universal. After millennia of oppression, the galaxy's enslaved peoples were finally making their stand. Captain Han Sol was piloting his fighter in the vanguard of the attack, leading a squadron of human pilots who had learned to fly like the heroes from ancient stories. His ship moved through the battlefield in ways that defied physics, spinning and diving between enemy fire as if he were dancing rather than fighting. "How is he doing that?" asked his wingman, Park Min, as she watched Han Sol's fighter twist through a barrage of energy beams that should have vaporized any normal ship. "Stop thinking like a pilot," Han Sol replied over the comm. "Start thinking like a dragon. Feel the currents of space. Move with the flow of energy around you." Behind them, the other pilots began to understand. Their ships weren't just machines anymore. They were extensions of their will, responding to imagination as much as to control inputs. Soon the entire squadron was weaving through the battle like a flock of mythical creatures, leaving trails of light that painted the darkness of space. On the planet's surface, Major Go Yun was leading the ground assault against the Veltar capital city. Her soldiers moved with perfect coordination, each one channeling the tactical genius of legendary commanders from human history. They didn't need radio communication. Somehow they all knew exactly what their comrades were thinking and planning. "Advance." "By sections," Go Yun called out, but her soldiers were already moving before she finished speaking. They flowed around enemy strongpoints like water around rocks, finding weak spots that shouldn't have been visible and exploiting them with surgical precision. The Veltar defenders found themselves fighting against an enemy that seemed to predict their every move. Human soldiers would duck behind cover just before enemy weapons fired, would charge exactly when alien morale was weakest, would retreat at the perfect moment to draw their enemies into traps. But the real battle was happening in the depths of space above the planet, where High Commander Zarketh was making his final desperate gambit. If he couldn't save his empire, he would at least make sure these upstart humans paid the ultimate price. "Activate the solar destabilizer," he ordered his remaining loyal officers. "Target the human homeworld star. If we must fall, we'll take their entire system with us." The weapon that emerged from his flagship was something the Veltar had built in secret over centuries, a device capable of triggering stellar collapse across interstellar distances. It was their ultimate doomsday weapon, something they had never needed to use because no species had ever threatened their supremacy. But as the weapon powered up, Zarketh found himself facing something he hadn't expected. The human warriors around him weren't just soldiers anymore. They had become living embodiments of every story their species had ever told about heroes who stood against impossible odds. "You cannot win," he broadcast to the human fleet. "Even if you destroy us, your son will die. Your homeworld will be consumed. Your species will end." Admiral Kim Su's response came back calm and steady. "You still don't understand what you're fighting, do you? We're not just one species anymore. We're every story of courage that was ever told, every legend of hope that was ever shared, every dream of freedom that ever lived in any thinking being's heart." The solar destabilizer fired, its beam racing toward Earth's sun across the vast distance of space. But as it traveled, something extraordinary happened. Human ships positioned themselves in its path, not to block it physically, but to transform it with the power of their collective will. The beam of destruction became something else, a wave of awakening that spread outward from Earth to every world the Veltar had ever conquered. On each planet, the local populations felt something stirring in their own genetic memories, their own suppressed legends and forgotten stories. The Veltar Empire didn't fall through conquest. It dissolved through transformation. The psychic conditioning that had kept their subject species obedient for millennia suddenly broke, as every enslaved being remembered who they had been before the conquest. Even the Veltar themselves were affected. Soldiers who had known only war suddenly remembered ancient poetry their ancestors had written. Commanders who had lived for conquest felt the pull of art and music they had abandoned centuries ago. Zarketh himself stood on his bridge as his empire crumbled around him, feeling emotions he hadn't experienced since he was young. "What have you done to us?" he whispered. "We reminded you how to dream," came the reply from Captain Han Sol, whose fighter now hovered peacefully outside the Veltar flagship's viewport. In the aftermath of the battle, as peace settled over the galaxy for the first time in 10,000 years, Dr. Li Han finally understood what had really happened. The artifacts his team had discovered weren't just ancient technology. They were seeds planted by a species that had lived long ago, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The predecessor race that left these artifacts knew this day would come, he explained to the newly formed Galactic Council. They seeded the galaxy with the potential for mythic awakening, but it needed a species pure enough in heart to unlock it. "Why humans?" asked a representative from the liberated Kithera worlds. "What made your species special?" Dr. Li Han smiled. "We never stopped telling stories. While other civilizations focused on technology and power, humans kept the old tales alive. We believed in heroes and magic and the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. That belief was the key." Commander Park, so now serving as humanity's first galactic ambassador, addressed the assembly of 100 different species. "We didn't conquer the Veltar Empire," she said clearly. "We helped everyone remember what they had forgotten. That there are powers stronger than fear, stronger than oppression, stronger than empire itself." She gestured to the representatives around her, beings who had been slaves just days before and were now free citizens of their own worlds. The power of hope, the power of stories, the power of believing that no matter how dark things get, there's always a chance for something better. The galaxy entered a new age where imagination could reshape reality, where ancient stories carried real power, and where the act of dreaming together could transform entire civilizations. Humanity took its place not as the rulers of this new order, but as its guardians, keeping the flame of wonder alive in a universe that had almost forgotten how to believe in miracles. And in the quiet moments between the stars, old stories continued to echo, waiting for the next time they would be needed to light the way toward hope.